So I guess at this point, do you have a sense of what the focus of the investigation is going to be?
Well, not yet. And one of the worst things you can do with an investigation is prejudge it. And so what we're trying to do is work in a bipartisan, collaborative way to establish a process to initiate an investigation, and we need to go in whatever direction that investigation takes us. So at this point, it's premature to talk about what it might find or where it might need to go. We know we have a series of reported allegations in the Globe. They're very serious, they're very disturbing, they're reprehensible, and we need to consider them in the context of the Massachusetts State Senate. And the investigation will be authorized to do that, assuming the members agree with what Senator Chandler and I produce. But there are two things that are important here. One, we want all of the members to know what's happening before we take action. And two, we want the public to know. And so at this point, we're in the process of structuring all of this, and we want to make sure that when we have that structure, we're going to communicate it to everyone and be prepared to take action in terms of launching the investigation.
And I guess kind of from the Senate perspective, is it what you're looking at, is it going to be the allegations of sexual misconduct or of potential interference into Senate business?
Everything involved in the situation that as it relates to the Senate at this point. And again, we're still structuring the language of it, so I want to be careful not to misrepresent anything or to speculate. But we should have something ready very soon that very clearly spells out what the parameters of the investigation are.
Do you know who you want the outside investigator to be?
I want the best person possible, and somebody with investigative experience and also with a keen knowledge of the law and the operations of the Senate and the law around sexual harassment.
But the person's not been brought on yet?
No, and because we need to operate as a body in that respect. And so what Senator Chandler and I will do is prepare a recommendation for the body. But this is something that involves the entire Senate, and we need to act that way. So we will act hopefully very soon on what is being developed right now.
And, you know, we in our newsroom couldn't think of a time that the legislature has brought on an outside investigator to look into something like this. Are you aware of this happening before?
It seems to me that there might have been some instances years ago in the House, actually, where the Ethics Committee might have retained special counsel at the very least. I'm not sure about particularly a special investigator.
And do you envision the investigator here having subpoena power?
I don't at this point. It seems to me that if that subpoena power is necessary, then that becomes an issue for the Ethics Committee, which can have subpoena power if authorized by the Senate.
And how would you kind of reconcile the fact that the people who came forward and spoke to the Globe were all anonymous? How do you go forward there? Well,
it's unfortunate that we don't have any more information, but I certainly and clearly understand the fear of retaliation. I understand that, and hopefully that's something that we're going to be able to work through. And my hope is that by structuring this investigation properly, we're going to create a climate where people feel that they can come forward and they can have honest discussions with the investigator or investigators, depending on how many there are, and that we can get to the bottom of this without having anyone feel unduly threatened by the process.
Do you think it's appropriate for the Senate President to continue leading the chamber while the investigation proceeds?
I think it's too soon to tell that right now. I think what it clearly is important to recognize is that the Senate President must have no influence and no contact with the proceedings around the investigation or whatever may happen subsequently.
Have you spoken to him since yesterday?
Not since yesterday at this point, because I'm working with Senator Chandler to structure this investigation. I don't think those communications would be appropriate for us to discuss the investigation.
And have you personally ever encountered anything with Brian Hefner in terms of...
I haven't. I've certainly been at events where he's been present and at functions and things, and have not witnessed any of this directly.
The allegations that he's been, kind of involved in Senate business and trying to, is that something you were either ever encountered personally or had heard of before?
I haven't encountered it personally, and it's interesting. He certainly has very strong political opinions, which he's been willing to share. But in my experience, they haven't crossed the line into trying to direct Senate policy.
Now, I know there's been some kind of comments about either setting up some of your colleagues in the Boston Rape Crisis Center have called for what they'd like to come out of this, in terms of a new independent human resources office, a policy to prevent or address sexual harassment. What do you think of the way the Senate is currently equipped to deal with things like
Well,
this?
I think that it deserves to be revisited. This is the kind of a thing where when you have these incidents, they are so impactful and they are so harmful to people that we need to always be vigilant about whether our policies are effective enough or whether there's anything more than we can do.
Mm-hmm.
And my experience in the Senate over the past several years is that we do revisit these things. I think now that examination will take on more intensity. But for instance, we have had joint caucuses and have had presentations by folks about what the policy is and what we should be looking for in terms of prohibiting harassment. So from my perspective, those things have been evolving over a period of time, and I have no problem with increasing that consideration to say, is there more that we can do? Certainly the House has been looking at that, and most recently the Senate President had indicated that we would look at a policy particularly for interns, and this is the kind of a situation where I think we need to continue to evolve the policy, and there will never be a time, in my humble opinion, where we can rest and say that we're doing enough. We always have to make sure that we're doing enough.
Okay. Procedurally, where do you go from here?
Well, any kind of a special investigator would have to be authorized by the Senate. So that is something that is going to need to happen. Hopefully it will happen sooner than later. But again, it needs to happen.
Would Monday be
It certainly could be that soon. But it needs to happen with the consent of the body. And it needs to happen as we transmit that information about what is going to be considered to the public.
Why go with an outside investigator?
Because it's important that we have an unbiased situation here, and we don't want to have the appearance of a conflict of interest or a conflict of interest. This is an important subject. People's lives have been harmed, according to the allegations. The Senate has been impacted here potentially, and we can take no chance that the investigation or any subsequent action would be compromised by a conflict or an appearance of conflict.
And do you foresee the Senate Ethics Committee being involved as well? Or?
I do. I don't think it's hard to foresee that when information comes back, the Ethics Committee will have to evaluate whether there is a cause for it to take up this case. It's too soon to tell that right now, but if we look at the way the Senate would normally process these kinds of situations, the Ethics Committee would be the appropriate place to have further action and even further consideration.
And did what you read in the story and the allegations it contained leave you with any questions about President Rosenberg's ability to serve in his post?
It made me deeply concerned about what the Senate President is clearly struggling with regard to the situation. Obviously, I'm horrified by what I read, and I think that, like all of us, the Senate President needs to carefully think about how other circumstances in his life may affect his situation here. My experience has been that he's been a collaborative leader of this body. He has tried to empower the members of this body in an unprecedented way, and he certainly has demonstrated time and again that he cares about the Senate in a very deep way. So I'm confident that now he's evaluating what this will mean for that commitment to the Senate. And it's, again, we're at the very beginning of this. We're talking about a newspaper story that hasn't been out there very long. There's a lot to think about, and I can assure you that a lot of us are.